Yes, so I started out at LBCC. My uncle had gone to Oregon State University, and he told me stay at community college as long as possible, not only for the financial security of that, but also just because you have more one-on-one time with your instructors. So I went to LB first to really figure out what I was doing and how to become an artist, and I knew how to draw, but I really didn't know how to do anything else. I didn't know how to paint properly. I thought that I wasn't a good painter. So that was where I went to really hone the skills and really start to figure out what I was going to have to do in order to push myself into getting a BFA. And now I'm at Oregon State University, and I feel much more secure in having that kind of background.
So Rosalie, you are an art student still. And how does that work for you? How can you, do you have a development that you can already see in your work?
I think so. I think when I first started working and producing artwork, it was completely disconnected all over the place. It was just really, whatever I wanted to focus on at the time, wildly different appearances and media. And when I look back through my sketchbooks, it's just disjointed. But I think that by doing that, I kind of found a language that I sort of was able to communicate with. And now I still feel, drawn to drastically different media. I don't consider myself just a painter, even though, as a university student, you have to take painting or printmaking, and you have to separate your disciplines. But I think that for me, the biggest development in my artistic practice has been the ability to transition between media and have a consistent appearance and dialogue that's going on throughout the artwork. So I think that that's sort of the biggest development.
Well, I kind of snuck in by the back door. My mother was an artist all her life, a fine one, and that is a kind of a scary situation for somebody who isn't sure whether they have art skills or not. So I went into science. But what I did was natural history, marine biology. I loved the animals, I loved the details, I loved knowing how they were made and built, and that extends to other parts of the natural world as well. And so I remember taking a course in scientific illustration when I was in college and being really quite good at drawing accurately what I saw. But I didn't have time. I was working as a scientist and raising 3 children, and I was like, okay, there isn't time for art. But about the time my oldest child went off to college, I suddenly had a space in the house that I could work in, and I thought, well, okay, it's time to maybe think about taking my embroidery and quilting to a new level. And quite unexpectedly at that point, I was introduced to katazome, which is Japanese stencil dyeing. It turns out there was a man in Roseburg whose good friend in Japan, the mayor of Roseburg's Japanese sister city, brought this Japanese indigo dyer to Roseburg, and I heard about it, and I went down there and I cut a stencil. I had loved the Japanese traditional patterns, the stencils, you could find them in Dover books and that sort of thing, and I'd seen an exhibit of them in Chicago at one time and thought, oh my God, but no way in the world in the United States you're ever going to learn how to do that. So I went down, I took this class, and I cut a stencil, and I kid you not, it was a conversion experience. I absolutely knew that that was what I was supposed to do. And that was 22 years ago, and I'm still cutting stencils. And then in recent years, I finally got my courage, maybe the last 5 or 6 years, to realize that I could also draw. And so I'm beginning to do, as she did all her life, fill sketchbooks, small watercolors, capturing details of things, capturing my experience of travel. And those sketchbooks now are showing up in my stencil designs and in the quilts that I make. So what goes around comes around, I think. And there's not a day, I don't think, that goes by that I'm not doing some kind of art. Got me through the deaths of my parents and a lot of other things that were stressful and difficult. And without that art and the art community that has developed, especially online, I don't know. I don't know how I'd cope. I think initially, what appeals to me is that you're generating a pattern the way a printmaker would, and I identify really as a printmaker. You're making a tool, and you can use the tool then very freely when it comes to the application of color. And yet you still have a defined, crisp-edged pattern. And so in that sense, it's like tinting an engraving or something like that. You've established the base of the pattern with the tool, and then you're very free to use color after that. And the colors that I use are powdered watercolor pigments in soy milk, which acts as the binder. And one of the things that I particularly like about that is that the soft Japanese brushes that you use that don't damage the resist paste that is on your fabric allow you to do beautiful graded transitions of color, which is very a watercolor kind of technique, but it's applied in a printmaking way, which I think is interesting.
Well, I don't really consider myself a printmaker per se, but I am interested in a lot of different kinds of printmaking. I don't really agree with the perspective that you have to separate out the disciplines, that you have to be a painter or a printmaker. So I find myself, I make a lot of prints, and then I paint on top of them. And I just really want to choose the media that works for the project and not necessarily limit myself to one particular kind of practice. It's really important to me to be sort of a jack of all trades and to choose what's important when it's important. And then as far as color palette and kind of formal elements go, that definitely changes very much for me based on the time of year. So in the fall, I tend to produce very, very dark work, lots of red and black type of work. And then when it comes into the spring and the summer, I find that I am all about the pastels and the bright colors. So I can definitely track my work based on what time of year it was produced.
I think what I share with the Japanese is a deep reverence for my own natural history. And that is reflected very much in the imagery that I use for the most part. I started out cutting tide pool animals and native plants, and eventually somewhere along the line I realized that there were abstractions in the natural world that I could use to produce pattern that was just pattern, but that came from a natural source. And if you think about the families of pattern, there's radial patterns and grid-like patterns and branch-like patterns, and there's a whole study of the names of different patterns. And depending on your vantage point, whether you're looking close up or from a great distance, many things in the natural world form patterns that are abstractions in their own right. And so that sort of thing, where you were producing texture, began to be really very much of interest to me. Well, of course, I work with watercolors, and the traditional Japanese pigments that I use doesn't include bright red, for example. Sometimes you can get vermilion, although that's tricky. So I have to, and it doesn't have a bright yellow. So I've learned to mix colors that end up being, in this part of the world, pretty characteristic of the soft light that we see in the Northwest. So everything.
Well, I think my favorite artwork in the entire world, which of course is owned by the Uffizi Gallery, is Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith slaying Holofernes from the Baroque period. And I think that the reason why I'm so attracted to that painting in particular was, as you said, back in art history, it was all just, white men saying everything. And that painting to me was the first time, not the very first time, but the first time in the Renaissance that a woman was able to kind of stand up and give her own perspective and her own narrative. And that's something that's really important to me.
I think about going into the Jeu de Paume in Paris and surrounding myself with Monet's water lilies. I would love to have art that completely surrounded me. I don't know if I could well, money's no object. It would be water lilies, but I would love to live inside art in that way.